The school halls were quiet this fine Friday morning. Mad Scientist School was in its third semester, and our mad scientist in training was wandering through the sophomore halls, searching for his ethics course. As he was walking, looking at his schedule and not paying attention, he crashed into a small being. Biology and theology books crashed all over this tiny form. "Hey, watch it, you little monster!" our scientist in training bellowed, as the small figure winced in pain. "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, sir, but I can't find my Henchman 101 class. These holes have a foul fungus that I'm allergic to, and I must dodge the patches of it on the floor." "Well, mind yourself," our scientist exclaimed. The small figure stood transfixed at the confidence of our scientist in training. Later that day in the cafeteria, our scientist in training was devouring his lunch, salamander sandwich with extra slime sauce, when the small figure came bounding up. "Good sir, our instructor said I must apprentice under a scientist in training, and you're the only one I know." As he wiped away the squishy salamander slime chunk from his cheek, our scientist in training thought for a moment. "Go fetch me 4 vials of faith fluid, 2 bottles of extract of evangelist, and 8 tubes of teenager tears, and meet me in the laboratory. We'll see if you have what it takes to be my apprentice." At 8:30, our scientist in training was waiting. The laboratory doors suddenly burst open and the small figure walked in, carrying a large box of ingredients. "It took me all day, sir, but I was able to find what you wanted." Shocked, the small figure was able to come up with the ingredients so quickly, our scientist in training smirked. "What's your name?" he asked. "Igor, master," the small creature squeaked. "Well, Igor, I want to make the perfect Christian one day, but tonight my experiment is to make a perfect youth pastor." They worked late into the night. Failing in their task, they forgot the patience potion, but a working relationship was soon secured.
It was a fine Friday morning, and our scientist in training was in his third semester of science school. While walking down the sophomore halls, he bumped into a little being, and biology and theology books flew everywhere. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir, but I'm looking on for my How to Make Us Chemicals 101 class. I don't know where I'm going." So, our scientist in training pointed the little being in the right direction and went on about his day. Later that day, our scientist in training was in the lunchroom eating his salamander sandwich with an extra side of slime when the little being came up to him and said, "Excuse me, sir, but one of my professors says I need to apprentice under an older scientist in training, and you're the only one I know." So our scientist in training wiped the salamander chunks off his lips and said, "Well, let's first start by telling me your name." "It's Igor, sir." "Okay, Igor," said our scientist in training. "I need you to meet me in the laboratory to help me make the perfect Christian. But first, you need to bring me 2 vials of love, 4 bottles of patience, and 8 tubes of humility." The next day at 8:30 a.m., here comes our little man waddling into the laboratory. "Excuse me, sir. It took me all night, but I was able to find what you wanted." Impressed that the little man was able to find the thing so soon, our scientist in training said, "Well, let's go to work and try to make the perfect Christian." So they set off making their youth pastor. And in the process, they somehow forgot to add the bottles of patience. But they worked and accomplished their task. The end.
It was a fine Friday morning, and our scientist in training was on his way through the biology department when suddenly he happened to bump into a small fellow who was carrying many books, both of which consisted of biology and theology. They went hither and yon, to and fro, He then picked them up, and the small fellow said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm lost, and I need help." And so he picked him up and got him going and sent him on the way to the class, because they're in some sort of science building, I believe. They are in fact in a science building. And they then part company. And our scientist in training, who is training to be a scientist, then goes about his day, ends up at lunch, is consuming none other than a salamander sandwich, as one does. Loving that salamander sandwich, and he sees the little fellow again. The little fellow comes to him and he says, "I understand that you are a scientist in training, and I myself need to train under another scientist, and I was told that you might be able to help me out." And so what happens is he says, our scientist in training says, I think we can work together. I'm gonna need a few things. One, I'm gonna need your name. And so the little guy says, it's Igor. To which he says, "Great. 2, I need you to bring me 3 things. I need 3 vials of love, 1 large box of hope, and a satchel of patience. I need you to find it. I need you to bring it to me in the lab." Some would say a laboratory, but I'm not on board that. So he then goes about, our scientist in training goes about his business. In the event that Igor can find all of these things, he says, we're gonna do this. So he's in the lab, he's working on his stuff. He is a scientist in training to be a scientist. Then Igor shows up and he says, "Took me a while, took me a lot of work, but I got it. I've got the faith, the love, the hope." And he was lacking in the patience. But they put it together to create a being that is somehow a youth pastor without patience.
All right, here's the story. The scientist in training was walking down the street on a fine Friday afternoon. He was walking through the halls, and as he was walking through the halls, he bumped into a young man. And the young man bumped into him, and he dropped a bunch of his books on the ground, and he helped him with these books, and he was like, hurry, come on, I'm in a hurry here. I have to get to lunch and eat. I'm very busy. I'm a scientist in training. And so he gathered the young man gathered all of his books hastily, and he went off, and the scientist in training continued on meandering on the road and went down to the cafeteria, where he sat and ate a salamander sandwich. It was a delicious salamander sandwich, and as he was sitting there contemplating all of the things that a young scientist in training contemplates, this young man approached him again. And the young man came to him and said, "Hi, my name is Igor, and I want to be a scientist in training." And he goes, "That's interesting, because most people just want to become a scientist, but you want to become a scientist in training, which is what I am. But I think I could help you do this. Meet me at my laboratory, but you must bring 3 things, Igor. You must bring 3 vials of love, 1 bushel of hope, and a satchel of patience. Bring me those 3 things, and You can be a scientist in training. And Igor, very, very eager, left and was like, yes, I can definitely do this. And he dispersed and he finished his salamander sandwich and went to his laboratory. And eventually Igor returned. And when he returned with the things. He was like, I have them for you. And he gave them to him. And first he gave him the 3 vials of love. And then he gave him the bushel of hope. And then he was short on the patience. And the young scientist in training was like, that's fine, we're going to create a youth pastor or something, and he'll just be short on patience. The end.
Right. This is the story of the scientist in training. The scientist in training was walking on a college campus on a Friday afternoon when a man bumped into him and knocked over all of his books. He was gathering up his books and he was upset, and the man that he bumped into, his name was Igor. And the scientist in training begins yelling at him. He goes, "Oh, you don't understand. I'm in such a hurry. I'm a scientist in training. I have important things to do." Oh, and he's gathering his books, and he finally gets them all together, and he takes off. Later, he's in the cafeteria, and he's eating his salamander sandwich, and Igor approaches him once again, and he comes and he tells him, and he says, "Earlier you said you were a scientist in training, and I wanted to come back and talk to you because that's exactly what I want to do. I want to be a scientist in training." And the scientist in training is a bit amused and looks at him and he's, "Seriously? That's what you want to be, a scientist in training? Like, most people just want to be a scientist. They don't want to be the scientist in training." But no, sure enough, Igor says, like, "No, that's what I want to be, a scientist in training. That is my life goal. Can you help me?" So the scientist in training says, "Okay, I can help you. But what I'm going to need you to provide me with 3 things. And so I need you to bring me 3 vials of love, a bushel of hope, and a satchel of patience. And meet me in my laboratory this evening. And if you have those 3 things, then I'll help you." So the scientist in training leaves, and he goes to his laboratory. And of course, he assumed he would never see the man again. But sure enough, there's a knock at his door, and he answers, and it's Igor. And Igor says, "I've found the things that you've asked for." And so he shows him, and he has the 3 vials of love. He has the bushel of hope. And he realizes he doesn't have a satchel of patience. And so the scientist in training is like, no, this is all wrong. It doesn't work like this. No, we need those very specific items. And he racks his brain, and so finally he goes, okay, we'll try with what we have, and I think I can salvage it. We'll have to make a youth pastor. So there's your story.
This is the story of the professor in training. So one day there was a professor, and he was working on a college campus, and he was walking down the road, and he got bumped into by Igor, and Igor spilled his stuff everywhere, and it just went all over the ground. And he was mad because he said, "Don't you know how important I am and how busy I am?" And he left and went to the cafeteria. And while he was at the cafeteria, Igor came, and he said, "I want to do what you are doing. I want to be a professor in training." And the professor in training laughed and said, "You want to be a professor in training? Most people want to be a professor." Actually, it's a scientist. Most people want to be a scientist. He was a scientist. Not a professor. He was a scientist in training. And so he said, yes, that's what I want to do. I want to be a scientist in training. And so he said, okay, if you want to be a scientist in training, you need 3 things. You need 3 vials of love, you need a bushel of patience, and you need a little bit of hope. And so they left, and he thought he would never bring those things, and he went to the lab, and he hears a knock on the door, and there it is. It's Igor. And so he comes and and he has 3 vials of love and a bushel of patience, but no hope. And so they said, you know what we can do? We can make a youth pastor. That's the story.
Well, hello. I would like to tell you a story. A story of a young professor of science. Now, this professor of science was a little bit hungry and decided to leave campus to go get a bite to eat. So when he left campus, he was walking, and this young man ran into him. A very handsome young Igor. Now, Igor wanted to be a professor of science as well. And so they ended up having lunch together. And the professor of science said, Igor, why do you want to be a professor of science? And Igor said, well, I want to be a professor of science in training to teach people about science. How do I do that? And the professor of science said, to be a professor of science in training, you need 3 things. You need 3 vials of valor, a bushel of hope, and a bucket of pride. And from that, you can become a professor of science in training. So Igor went out and tried to find the vial of valor, the 3 vials of valor, the hope, and the bucket of peace. And when he came back, he only had the 3 vials of valor, the hope, but he did not have any peace. And the professor said, you need peace to be a professor of science in training.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to tell you a story that was told to me long ago, about 20 seconds ago, by a very strange old man. It's a story about a handsome young scientist, a man of science, I believe was his official title. A professor. He was a professor of science. And one day, he was going along on his scientific research, and a strange little man appeared underneath his right armpit. I believe his name was Igor. And Igor, something like that, he said to him, "How do I become a man of science?" And the handsome young scientist said, "Well, it's easy. All you need is these three things. Number one, you need a vial of hope. Go get me a vial of hope. Number two, you need to get me a bushel of joy. A bushel of joy. One vial of hope, one bushel of joy, and one giant bucket of peace. You get me those three things, and I will train you how to be a man of science." So Igor headed out on his journey, and about 2 blocks down, he completely forgot what the order was, what the right recipe was. But he did his best. He went into the market, he did what he could, and he returned back to the young, handsome scientist. And he said, "Master, I brought back what you were asking." The scientist looked at what he had. He had 2 vials of valor, and he completely forgot the peace, the bucket of peace. So the handsome young scientist was very disappointed, and he said, "I'm sorry, I just can't train you at this point, at this stage in your development. You completely forgot the peace. So better luck in your future endeavors as in another profession, but this isn't going to work out." And that's the story that was told to me long ago when I was just a young 34-year-old 20 seconds ago.
I'm supposed to tell you a story that I heard from this phenomenal, cool, hipper than hip musician named Dr. Andy Ray, who, I haven't talked to in a long time. I would just love to chat, tell him I apologize for all the abuse he took from Richard and Sean, but just how, again, he's hip and cool and I'm not. But that being said, he told me a really cool story that I would like to pass on to you. It made me reevaluate a lot of my values, what's important to me. It made me think I need to start my own nonprofit. So it's a pretty meaningful story, and I just want to pass it on to you. So here is the story. A long time ago, an importunate friend came up to actually I scrapped that. It's not an importunate friend. I totally made that up. Here, let me start this story again. All right, this is what I heard from the estimable, the amazing Andy Ray. All right, this is what I heard. There was a beautiful, importunate young scientist who was handsome. Probably as handsome as Andy, or Jake. Jake's a handsome dude. And this handsome scientist was working in his lab, and one day his assistant Igor came up to him. Now the interesting thing about Igor is, according to Andy, he lives in his armpit, which I thought was an interesting place to live. I don't know how small he is, or if it's just his head, or if it's like a bifurcation of his body, but anyway, this handsome young scientist is working in his lab when all of a sudden Igor, and it's not Igor, it is Igor, pops out of his armpit and says, "Hey, how can I be a scientist just like you? How can I be a scientist that is just as phenomenal and as amazing as you. And the scientist told him, to be an amazing scientist, you will need three things. Three things. And those three things are, and he looked around and he whispered, because he didn't want everybody else to become a great scientist, right? So he said, those three things that you need to be a great scientist are: 1, a vial of hope; 2, a pail of peace; and 3, a vat of joy. A vial of hope, a pail of peace, and a big ol' honkin' vat of joy. That's the 3 things you need. Well, I mean, started talking like this. Those are the 3 things you need. So Igor hops out of his armpit. I'm not exactly certain how that works. And then went to the market. And he said, I've got to find those 3 things. A vial of hope, a pail of peace, and a vat of joy. A big honkin' vat of joy. So Igor looks and he shops around. And I'm thinking, to fit in the armpit, he was either really small and sort of, short person's midget sort of level, or maybe he expanded. I think that would be interesting to see. But eventually he bought things, and he bought what he needed, and he bought the best he could in the time he had. And he came back to the handsome young scientist, Andy Ray, good looks, right? And came back to him and said, hey, I've got what I need. Excuse me, I'm choking up. It's a little sad. It's because, anyway, I'm giving away the end of the story. But anyway, Igor comes back and he says, listen, I've got all I need. And the young scientist says, all right, what is it? And he came back and he had 2 vials of valor. That's all he had. 2 vials of valor. Where was the hope? Where was the joy? Where was the peace? The idiot couldn't listen very well, total moron, came back with 2 vials of valor. The scientist leaned forward and he said, Igor, get back in my armpit, because you failed. You've totally failed. And that's the story. And that's what I heard. And it troubles me. But I hope we can all learn something from it. So take those words of wisdom. Good luck. God bless. And I'll see you later.